Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive. We've got quite a stack of sources you sent over articles, some research papers, notes.
Yeah, quite a bit to get through.
Definitely. And it's all focused on a really critical topic: the impact that militarized federal actions are having on communities of color.
Mm,
Our goal today really is to cut through all the noise. We want to pull out the key findings, the sharpest insights, maybe some surprising facts, too.
right, so you can get up to speed quickly on what is, let's face it, a pretty complex issue.
Exactly, without feeling totally overwhelmed. Now, what these sources seem to consistently point towards are, well, escalating challenges, particularly for African American and Latino populations.
Hmm.
We're seeing increased federal actions that have this sort of military feel to them, and the sources raise some pretty significant red flags about civil rights, about community cohesion.
That's right. The picture painted across these different sources, it shows a worrying trend, like an acceleration in the use of these militarized tactics.
By federal agencies.
Yeah, federal agencies, including Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE,
Yeah.
but also they even document cases where actual military personnel got involved in domestic policing situations.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just, typical law enforcement styles. And the sources, they connect these actions to bigger patterns, things like arrests of elected officials,
Right.
which suggests potentially a chilling effect on dissent. The overall context here, according to what we're reading, is really one of rising tensions.
And an erosion of rights.
An erosion of basic rights, yeah, and community voices feeling silenced.
Okay, so let's drill down into that a bit. What does it actually look like on the ground? The sources spend a good amount of time detailing intensified ICE raids,
They do.
often targeting immigrant communities, right? In big urban areas, LA, Sacramento are mentioned.
Yeah, those come up repeatedly.
And they really highlight the tactics being used. We're talking pretty aggressive approaches, armed agents, tactical gear, sometimes overwhelming homes or workplaces.
It sounds intense.
It does. And it's clear from reading this stuff that the impact isn't just about detaining people. The way these operations happen seems almost designed, maybe intentionally, maybe not, to create widespread fear.
And that climate of fear, that's a huge theme running through these sources.
Yeah.
They really emphasize how these raids create this pervasive anxiety.
Throughout whole communities.
Absolutely. Throughout immigrant families, their neighbors,
Mhm.
you read about constant worry, loved ones being targeted, people drastically changing their daily routines.
Like staying home.
Yeah, or even decreases in school attendance because parents are just too scared to let their kids out.
Yeah.
And this isn't just personal stress, right? The sources show it actively breaks down community trust.
Undermines cohesion.
Exactly. And can lead to some really long-lasting emotional, psychological impacts.
Well, it makes sense that this would prompt strong reactions then.
Oh, definitely.
The sources document some fierce opposition from community leaders. They often frame these raids as basically attacks on human dignity.
Which is a strong statement.
It is, and advocacy groups are stepping up, working hard to, shine a light on the consequences, push for policy changes, more protections.
There's clearly immense pressure, especially in places like California mentioned in the sources. It sparks these intense debates about the human cost of it all.
Yeah, and beyond ICE, the sources also look at instances of federal military deployment inside the U.S.
Right, that's another layer.
Specifically pointing to what happened in Los Angeles back in 2020. The decision then involved federalizing National Guard troops and deploying Marines.
Yes, Marines too. The stated reason, at least according to the sources, was a response to civil unrest, protests against racial injustice. It was framed as needing to restore order.
Okay, but the sources dive into the fact that not everyone agreed with that framing.
Not at all. There were really contrasting perspectives.
Supporters, including some local authorities cited, felt, okay, this military presence might deter violence, enhance security during a volatile period. But crucially, many Californian officials, the governor included, strongly pushed back. Very strongly.
How did they frame their opposition?
The sources describe them seeing it as major federal overreach, a threat to citizens' rights. They argued that domestic issues like civil unrest should be handled locally.
By local law enforcement, not the federal military.
Exactly. And this conflict really highlights that complex, often fraught relationship between state and federal power when the military enters the domestic picture. The sources detail that tension really well.
Which brings up a really critical legal point the sources get into,
Mm.
the constitutional implications,
Yeah,
particularly around the Posse Comitatus Act.
right. Can you quickly remind us what that is?
Sure, it's a federal law, basically, that generally prohibits using U.S. military personnel to enforce domestic laws or policies.
Okay.
So critics, cited in these sources, argue that deploying federal troops in a policing role just blurs those crucial lines, military versus civilian functions.
And the concern is?
The concern they raise is that militarizing policing could actually escalate tensions, especially, between communities of color and law enforcement, making existing divisions even worse.
Okay. The sources also flag another type of federal action that feels incredibly significant.
Which is?
The arrest of elected officials by federal agents. They point to the case involving Senator Alex Padilla as a really stark example.
Yeah, that caused quite a stir.
And it raises deep concerns, according to the sources, about federal power maybe being used for political reasons. What are the motivations behind actions like that?
Serious question.
And it's not just about the individual official, right? The sources suggest it casts this long, chilling shadow over civic engagement, especially within marginalized communities.
It absolutely does. The sources argue that when elected representatives, people chosen by voters to be their voice, are arrested by federal agents, it sends a powerful message, and potentially a damaging one. Well, it tells voters, essentially, that there might be real risks involved in just participating politically. For communities of color, which the sources note already face systemic barriers to civic life.
This feels like another barrier.
It can be perceived that way, yeah, like a direct effort to undermine or suppress their collective voice, their political power. The sources connect this to less trust in government institutions overall.
Which complicates an already tough relationship.
Exactly, because silencing perceived advocates can breed, profound alienation and distrust.
Absolutely. And the sources kind of broaden this out, arguing this perceived repression seeps into wider societal issues, too.
How do they mean?
The feeling that maybe dissent isn't welcome or it's even risky, that can actively discourage activists, community leaders, especially in areas already heavily impacted by this federal presence.
So people might hold back.
Yeah. This trend, which the sources actually describe as a form of repression, can create a widespread chilling effect, makes people hesitant to engage openly, in dialogue or advocacy about really vital issues like social justice and equity.
And if we connect this specifically to the potential impact on Black communities, the sources highlight a particularly worrying development.
Okay.
They note that these militarized federal actions, which, as we discussed, have often been directed towards Latino communities, are now reportedly expanding, and rapidly.
Expanding where?
Into predominantly Black cities. This raises significant new concerns, specifically around civil liberties and personal safety within those populations.
So introducing these military-like responses into areas that often have their own, let's say, complex histories with law enforcement.
Right. The sources argue it doesn't just enforce laws. It actually exacerbates existing systemic inequalities. It can normalize state violence.
Then erodes trust further.
Profoundly erodes trust between law enforcement and the communities they're supposed to serve. Given the historical context of policing in many Black neighborhoods, which the sources argue is often deeply intertwined with discriminatory practices, racial profiling,
a militarized posture just pours fuel on the fire.
It risks intensifying what's already a volatile situation. It potentially exposes residents to more surveillance, more aggressive encounters.
And this vulnerability, it's not just about individual risks.
No, it has broader implications for the whole community's well-being. And, as the sources suggest, it may actively deter political participation.
Because people fear reprisal.
Exactly. The sources specifically point to the chilling effect this can have on civic engagement, on collective efforts to advocate for needed change.
So the potential for abuses under this kind of militarized model, the sources see that as a significant threat to fundamental rights.
A very significant threat, yes. They express real concern that as these tactics become more confrontational, more widespread, they could disproportionately target Black communities, reinforcing existing biases.
Which leads to a really pressing question posed by the sources themselves.
Which is?
Who gets held accountable? When abuses by federal authorities happen under this increasingly militarized approach, where does the accountability lie?
That's a critical question with no easy answers presented. Looking ahead, the sources do venture into some predictions how this landscape might evolve.
What do they see coming?
Well, they see a trajectory pointing towards potential escalation. They note the increase in both ICE operations and these military-like deployments in major cities as part of a broader strategy,
A strategy they interpret how?
as an assertion of federal authority. Based on their analysis, communities can likely expect, well, heightened tensions and potentially more surveillance going forward.
And what comes next, according to the sources, likely a rise in pushback.
Yes, specifically legal pushback. As these operations intensify, they predict we'll see a range of legal challenges coming from affected communities, civil rights advocates.
So the courts become battlegrounds.
Potentially major battlegrounds, yeah.
Right.
Examining the constitutionality of these actions, looking at specific issues like civil liberties violations, excessive force allegations, maybe infringement on local governance. This also raises a crucial point about how communities themselves might respond beyond the legal system. Right. The sources suggest community organizations are likely to mobilize even further, perhaps forming broader coalitions specifically aimed against federal overreach.
Grassroots movements.
Grassroots movements, they argue, will keep using advocacy, direct action, trying to raise public awareness and galvanize support. The sources highlight how this interplay of the formal legal challenges plus the grassroots mobilization could create a kind of synergy.
Drawing media attention, policymaker attention.
Exactly, and potentially influencing future federal practices.
So the overall picture, based on these sources, suggests both increased militarization and growing resistance efforts happening at the same time.
It's a dynamic they stress is absolutely imperative to watch closely.
Yeah. And a key element of that resistance, the sources argue really strongly, is the vital role of solidarity across communities.
That comes through very clearly.
They frame the challenges faced by both Black and Latino populations here as deeply interlinked, which prompts what they call an urgent need for solidarity.
To sort of fortify collective efforts against this federal overreach. The idea is that joining forces leverages shared experiences, shared resources. It amplifies the voices demanding civil rights and justice.
The sources give some powerful examples of this kind of collaboration actually happening. Diverse groups protesting together against systemic injustices, standing under common banners to highlight shared struggles.
And that unity, they suggest, sends a clear message to policymakers.
Yeah.
That these demands for justice, for equity, they can't be easily ignored or dismissed when communities stand together.
And what's really compelling is how the sources show the solidarity isn't just protesting, it's manifesting in concrete civic actions, too. Collaborative initiatives, things like joint voter registration drives, or maybe shared legal aid clinics, ways to strengthen collective political power and better protect community rights.
Practical steps.
Exactly. Civil rights organizations, the sources note, play a pivotal role here in fostering these alliances, focusing on coalition building to ensure unity, mutual support in the face of adversity. It promotes a more holistic approach to advocacy, emphasizing shared purpose.
Ultimately, the sources really view this solidarity between Black and Latino communities not just as like a nice idea,
And it has essential.
as a necessary and powerful strategy to effectively combat the increasing encroachment of these militarized federal actions. Through joint efforts, they argue, these communities can forge a more unified, more effective front for justice.
Which brings us to right. And at its core is that fundamental tension the sources identify. National security justifications on one side.
And civil liberties on the other, especially for communities of color who, as the sources point out, often bear the brunt of these actions.
The sources place this case against that backdrop we've been discussing, increasing federal militarization in areas seeing social unrest.
And critics, whose views are reflected in the sources, argue these federal actions disproportionately target marginalized communities.
Governor Newsom, in this specific case cited, contended the federal actions were a significant overreach, infringing constitutional rights. He argued for the state's role in protecting citizens from what he saw as unlawful military force used domestically.
The potential outcomes of a case like that are, well, according to the sources, pretty significant. A ruling favoring Newsom could set a precedent, maybe limiting federal authority for domestic military deployment without clearer due process or state consent.
And the alternative.
Conversely, a ruling favoring the federal government could further entrench this militarized approach, raising those serious concerns documented in the sources about potential erosion of individual rights, especially in communities frequently subjected to this type of enforcement.
So, the trajectory of these legal battles is incredibly important, not just for the immediate situation, but for shaping the future balance of federal-state interactions and protecting civil liberties.
Absolutely. The ongoing deliberations, as noted by the sources, really underscore the vital role of a robust, independent judiciary in safeguarding fundamental rights against potential government overreach, ensuring the rights of all communities are upheld.
Okay. So, as we start to bring this deep dive toward a close, the pervasive risks highlighted across all these sources, they seem starkly clear, especially for communities of color.
They really do.
The concerns raised about civil liberties, about the potential normalization of a militarized federal presence, particularly in predominantly marginalized neighborhoods. It feels significant, hard to ignore.
And connecting it to the bigger picture. The sources consistently underscore how these actions, they don't just enforce laws in a vacuum. They actively exacerbate existing inequalities. They contribute to a climate of fear, deep mistrust.
Which undermines democratic principles.
Fundamentally undermines democratic principles,
Yeah.
yeah. Weakens civil society.
Yeah.
And again, with a disproportionate impact on communities of color.
The sources really conclude with what feels like a powerful call to action. They frame awareness, active engagement as just absolutely necessary components for driving meaningful change, for safeguarding civil liberties moving forward.
And they powerfully reiterate that idea we discussed coming together. In solidarity with a shared purpose, actively championing these fundamental rights. That it's essential for achieving justice.
So what does all of this mean for you listening in? Here's a final thought drawn directly from the material we've explored today, just something to consider. Given the potential, the sources highlight for increased militarization and that corresponding rise in resistance efforts we talked about, what role do you think individual awareness and maybe focused local engagement play in actually shaping the future landscape, the future of civil rights, the presence of federal authority right there in the communities you live in, or maybe the ones you care most deeply about?